the High River gun grab. The rain kept falling and the snow was melting fast. The river was rising at an alarming rate, flowing faster than anyone had ever seen. As it overflowed, people's homes were flooded. The evacuation order was given and some needed to be rescued. 3 people died. Within a few days, High River, Alberta was a ghost town. Homes were abandoned with all their belongings, and the only people around were the responders meant to mitigate damage and support survivors, including those who refused to leave. The impact on this small community was devastating, and would be for years to come. Amidst the chaos and destruction, RCMP members moved from house to house under their emergency protocols. Their actions would shatter the trust of an already broken community and called into question their motivations when assisting in this crisis situation. Hello and welcome to Maple Moose Mysteries, the podcast where we take a look at unsolved Canadian mysteries and crimes, providing you with the context, history, and theories to draw your own conclusions. Today, we bring you the story of the High River gun grab in 2013. Against the backdrop of a disastrous flood, the worst many in the area had ever seen, RCMP were accused of using the circumstances to further their agenda. The public outcry that resulted led to inquiries that went on for years, some even to this day. As the narrative develops, the blame kept shifting, and what we are left with is a bombshell story that left people across the country outraged. Was the RCMP liable for their decisions, and if so, would they face consequences? Let's dive in. The flood. High River, Alberta is a small town of about 13,000 people. Located just south of Calgary, the town originally acted as a crossing for settlers over the local Highwood River. In 1901, it was recognized as a village before becoming incorporated as a town in 1906. Throughout its history, the area has been subject to its fill of flooding, and attempts have been made to control it. 100 years of flooding taught the town to be prepared, but even they were not ready for what was coming. High River has a canal system to deal with the floodwaters that, in 2013, ultimately proved ineffective when they were hit with an unthinkable level of rain. Cities all over Alberta were impacted, but the southern areas were hit the hardest, with High River in particular subjected to 325 milliliters or 12.8 inches of rainfall in under 48 hours. This also accelerated the melting snow in the area from the nearby Rocky Mountains, leading to a wider and faster flowing Highwood River than anyone had seen in years. On June 20th, 2013, the floodwaters began pouring into town, catching city staff and citizens off guard as the main streets were flooded and the water backflowed into other neighborhoods. Cars were overtaken and many were forced to flee their homes. The situation quickly escalated into a full-on disaster, and the town entered a local state of emergency. An order was given for evacuation. Plans for search and rescue, security, home entry, and re-entry were formulated by law enforcement. This was complicated by the fact that floodwaters quickly knocked out most of the town's telecommunications, and first responders, which included the officers of the RCMP, were stretched thin with little way to keep in contact with each other when out in the field. Temporary evacuation centers were coordinated where safe. The evacuation notice trickled out slowly while townsfolk scrambled to make it to safety. By June 21st, the armed forces had been called in to assist with search efforts as calls of missing people increased. The rushing water was sweeping people away. Helicopters were being employed to rescue some people from the roofs of their homes. Bullhorns were being used in the street to continue relaying the need to evacuate. The RCMP implemented a door-to-door search in which they accessed buildings by any means to look for stragglers, and their search included homes unaffected by flooding. Homes were to be re-entered as needed to assess potential health and safety risks related to the structures themselves. Officers received the following direction: search every house, record the house number and whether empty or occupied. Entry is required to ensure life. For occupied homes, document who is in the home, who is missing, and the names of the next of kin. Searched homes to be marked with tape. Don't go through deep water. Secure homes upon leaving. On loud hailer, identify police. Some homes could be accessed through their garage doors, but others needed to be entered by breaking in by whatever means the RCMP could dream up, as long as it was deemed reasonably necessary to carry out their mandate to ensure no loss of life. Where available, locksmiths were called in to assist with access. By June 22nd, most of the town's 5,000 homes and 13,000 residents had been evacuated. Continued efforts were made to assess the damage and limit water movement. There were plenty of other tasks that popped up, such as the care of animals that were left behind. On June 23rd, the following letter was to be given to residents from the mayor, particularly those who were resistant in leaving their homes. Dear resident, the town of High River is presently under a local state of emergency. As a part of this, a mandatory evacuation order has been put in place. Although parts of the community were not directly affected by floodwater, the town's entire critical infrastructure has been compromised. At this time, the town's sewage and wastewater systems are not functioning. We only have very limited fresh water capacity and a boil water advisory is in effect. There is no food, medicine, gas, or electricity. Any fire or medical response is extremely limited. Traveling in the community and around the High River region is dangerous. Your continued presence is undermining the town's ability to react to this emergency. While you may think that you are secure and you're doing the right thing, your actions may result in a delay in allowing your neighbors, who respected the evacuation order, to return to their homes. This is a difficult situation for all of us, and we are all in this together. It's important for you to evacuate the town so that our emergency response people can make all our homes safe. We appeal and urge you to do the right thing. The RCMP enforced a no-go zone, patrolling the streets and using helicopters to make sure that no one snuck back into the town after they had been evacuated. This contributed to growing tension as the residents waited to be allowed back into their homes. By June 24th, many of them were restless. The staff of High River were exhausted as they had been working non-stop long hours. Over 1,000 pets were rescued and hundreds were being fed and maintained through the crisis. The RCMP had completed their door-to-door search. They deemed over 2,500 houses damaged, 600 of which were damaged to the point of being uninhabitable. They would later be torn down. Approximately 70% of the buildings in High River were impacted by water. On June 27th, the government of Alberta officially declared a province-wide state of emergency, allowing provincial leadership and resources to be brought in and used, including $50 million to High River to deal with the immediate costs and giving the staff on site a much-needed break. There were 3 fatalities in the High River area, which some considered to be shockingly low considering the circumstances and the panic that had arisen. The damage of the flood were not the only reports that were making headlines. Media had also picked up on the fact that RCMP had collected what they called a substantial amount of firearms from residents' homes. How the weapons had been apprehended and how they would be returned was unclear. Already heightened anxieties amongst residents were made worse by this news. Across Alberta, citizens were allowed to return to their homes, even those places with significant flooding, but the timetable for High River remained uncertain. Some residents were unable to return to their home for weeks. Other homes were destroyed. The flood left behind 40,000 tons of debris, and there was talk of mold and contaminants from wastewater, and many acknowledged how truly unprepared High River had been. However, slowly but surely they picked up the pieces. Safe drinking water, electricity, and telecommunications was restored. Volunteers continued to show up to provide resources and support. Plans to address training and mitigate future floods were announced, and more residents began to return home. But as they did so, they were confronted with yet another revelation. The grab. Upon returning to their homes, residents were shocked at the amount of damage. They had been kept out of the evacuation zone for at least 10 days. What many came back to in a lot of cases was not the result of the flood, but from the RCMP's forced entry to their homes. The RCMP had done everything necessary to get inside each house, with some doors left battered, opened, and unsecured. Many were left with a lofty bill and missing firearms. RCMP assured the public that the weapons that were taken were left out in the open, and that officers had made the initial decision to confiscate weapons based on their own intuition, rather than being ordered to. They had been collected and were being stored in a secure bay at the local RCMP detachment, and would be returned to residents with the proper ID. The RCMP claimed that their actions were justified due to the flood emergency. They also ran into a small number of residents who needed assistance, and over 300 residents who refused the evacuation order to leave. This created many safety variables. During that time, they came across the weapons, which they saw as a valuable and potentially dangerous piece of property. So they collected them. As the lockdown raged on, RCMP moved house to house, taking firearms they came across or marking the location to return at a later date. They were operating under the assumption that the emergency demanded this response. As the dust settled, it became increasingly clear that RCMP had entered hundreds of homes and confiscated perhaps hundreds of weapons. The backlash after residents returned home intensified. Rumblings on social media spread like wildfire. Town halls were called for residents to voice their disdain. Not only were the citizens of High River recovering from a disaster, but now they had come to find that more of their property was damaged or missing. There were reports of guns that were properly stored having been removed and confiscated, contradicting the RCMP's reports that weapons taken were always unsecured and out in the open. Regardless of their stated intentions, public trust in law enforcement hit an all-time low, and more questions about the RCMP's decision-making process during this disaster were raised. Some argued that these moves were a massive human rights violation and destroyed their confidence in law enforcement. There were published pieces in the news, such as a Sun News documentary 6 months down the road entitled Broken Trust. This highlighted several concerns that people had at the time. They called out the controversy for what they saw it as: that the RCMP had deliberately used the flooding as an excuse to break into people's homes and take their guns to disarm the population. That the RCMP did not care about finding survivors as much as their own agenda. As stated by the RCMP initially, homes were being searched for residents and their weapons were collected because of what they were and a normal course of their actions. Many people just didn't buy that, and felt that the seizure was a concerted effort by the RCMP. The lack of communication about the seizure of the weapons certainly did not help. If the true intention was to find people and hide weapons from looters, why kick in the doors of houses and leave their homes vulnerable with all of their other valuables? Why keep these developments from citizens? Why did they insist that the weapons taken were out in the open when many homeowners were claiming the opposite? The documentary inferred that police had targeted the homes of gun owners and disarmed the civilian population because they were worried what angry residents would do if they breached the barricades that RCMP had put up. This was just one of the theories. Others included the idea that RCMP were planning on charging residents criminally for unsafe storage of their firearms if they were found out in the open. Reactions from the province denied any special instructions or authority given to police to conduct door-to-door searches and placed the onus on RCMP. Over 600 firearms were taken from residents' homes. All the guns were eventually returned to those who provided documentation, but this seeming breach of privacy and trust led to numerous substantial complaints. The report. As a result of the controversy, the RCMP watchdog, the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission for the RCMP, were called in to give their assessment. They receive and investigate public complaints about the RCMP. This was not a short process. The complaints in this case were assessed as follows. Number 1. Whether the RCMP members involved in entering private residence in High River complied with all appropriate training, policies, procedures, guidelines, and statutory requirements. Number 2. Whether all RCMP members involved in seizing firearms from private residents in High River complied with all appropriate training, policies, procedures, guidelines, and statutory requirements. And number 3. Whether the RCMP policies overall were adequate to deal with this kind of situation. The commission interviewed dozens of individuals involved and combed through thousands of documents related to the seizure. Many of these documents were not available to the public. They released the report on February 12, 2015, and it presented a background of the situation, a chronology of the events, and a detailed analysis of the actions of the RCMP. The report disclosed 52 findings that clarified decisions around the emergencies in High River, as well as the RCMP's role in it, their private entry of residences, seizure of firearms, external communications, and emergency response. On the one hand, the report acknowledged that the RCMP had rights under the Emergency Measures Act, which was enacted, to act in a way that conserved life, which included forced entry into buildings, even those unaffected by flooding, and the use of reasonable force to enter them. However, many home entries were deemed to have caused unreasonable amounts of damage. Claims for housing and property paid out by the RCMP exceeded $2.4 million. On average, homeowners were paid $1,500 for damages done by the RCMP's forced entry. Though RCMP were authorized to collect unsecure firearms as part of their search, their response was reactive, and many of the weapons that they collected were determined to have been properly stored and not in plain sight, as would be needed for proper seizure of firearms in this situation. They also should have taken time to seek legal authority for the seizures after the fact, by reporting the weapons grabbed to a justice, which they did not do. Though the report commented that they and other personnel did a remarkable job overall in responding to the crisis, it also made clear that they had overstepped. The report did not paint the gun grab as a systematic disarming of the citizens, but as a result of disorganization and rash decision-making. They blamed the sloppy work on poor leadership and failure to adequately communicate with the public. In terms of next steps for the RCMP, the report also made 10 recommendations that they believe needed to be implemented moving forward. These changes included RCMP communication, emergency management policies and procedures, and additional training. Things like a national crisis handbook and guidelines for the seizure of firearms, ammunition, and other contraband during disasters. This report, released in 2015, was merely an interim one, and it garnered a response from RCMP Commissioner Bob Paulson. Paulson acknowledged the findings of the report and generally agreed with most of them. Any ones he disagreed with were addressed in a letter to the Commission. He said, "High River has taught us some important lessons about the extreme steps police sometimes need to take to ensure public safety and how this can have unintended impacts on people's lives." In 2016, the final report could be published, which they acknowledged took way too long. Now, with the final report in hand, the People's Court gave their own assessment. Some people saw the report as balanced, that it acknowledged that the RCMP was in the wrong and validated the concerns of gun owners who felt that they were unheard. Political leaders, even opposition leaders at the time, noted that the recommendations were straightforward and fair. Articles written in support of the report felt that the RCMP were being unfairly treated considering what they had to deal with. Not only were they managing a catastrophe, but they also had to manage the expectations of angry residents who wanted to return home. Who could blame them for making a few mistakes along the way, right? They had acted admirably in the line of duty and made several in-the-moment decisions that, upon reflection, could have been handled differently. But other people saw the report as weak. They wanted to see reprimands of the officers in charge, or even criminal charges being laid. The report was being called too lenient, trying to justify the actions of the RCMP and distorting certain details about the clarity of laws that were overstepped. The RCMP continued to face scrutiny over the years, and internally the Big Brass reported that they had gotten the message loud and clear. For the public, a path forward to regain trust was unclear. It was difficult to determine who was satisfied with the report versus who wanted more to be done, but there were signs. The anger from some residents resulted in a class action lawsuit that, while eventually dropped, indicated where some people's feelings were. Multiple telephone polls conducted by gun rights advocacy have been completed in the area in the years following to assess local attitudes. These polls indicate that many, as much as half of High River residents were unsatisfied with the report from the Commission and open to a further inquiry to reevaluate the gun grab. The call for a public inquiry moved at a snail's pace, with years of multiple back and forth between interested parties looking for all available documentation from the government. Those pro-inquiry pointed to the fact that no one was specifically held accountable. No names of the specific officers who authorized the gun grab were ever made public. Dennis Young, a firearms researcher who spearheaded a push for the inquiry until his death in 2021, outlined what he was looking for the RCMP to do to rebuild trust in the community. His opinions may be reflective of some others in the public. He called upon them to conduct an independent, scientifically valid poll of High River residents to accurately determine the current level of trust in the RCMP and determine who would have issues with further evacuations. He also called to release the documentation on everything related to High River rights violations and identify the person or persons directly responsible for ordering the RCMP to undergo their controversial actions. He asked that RCMP issue a public apology to the residents of High River and clarify going forward the step-by-step procedures police and the military are required to follow with forced entries into homes, searches without warrants, and seizures of property. Whether all of these expectations are realistic is anyone's guess. Talks of further action were delayed, as was everything with COVID-19. 9 years later, the High River gun grab is still remembered as one of the RCMP's most controversial responses, and its infamy remains a stain on their reputation. Is it worth the time, resources, and mental energy to dig for more answers and ask more questions? So, what do you think of the High River gun grab? Were RCMP actions rightly addressed, or was there more room for tangible actions and reprimands? Let me know what you think by following me on Instagram at Maple Moose Mysteries and sending me a message. If you want more mysteries, crimes, unsolved Canadian stories, be sure to follow this podcast, Maple Moose Mysteries, and give me a rating. It really helps me out and I appreciate it. If you do, hey, maybe we can grab a poutine sometime and talk about other Canadian stereotypes. I love Maple, I love mooses. I'd love to see you next time when we have a new mystery to share with you all.